Well, I'm here with Brad Marshall, who is an interesting voice online. He has a website called fireinabottle.net. He has a background in genetics from Cornell University and a culinary certificate from the French Culinary Institute. He's also done work in cancer research at Memorial Sloan Kettering and bioinformatics for the Berkeley Drosophila. Did I say that right? Drosophila Genome Project?
Drosophila.
Okay, Drosophila. So I totally didn't get that right.
That means fruit flies.
Okay, interesting. So you've got a lot of interest in various fields here, but now you've been getting a lot of attention because of your interest in understanding the role of saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat, and then some of the other deviations from that discussion as it relates to health and weight loss and fat accumulation. And so I thought here, as we kick off the new year, it'd be a great time to talk about this because everybody's talking about how to lose weight in January, right?
Right, exactly.
So
yeah, no, I love it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
I don't know where you want me to start. I could just jump in.
Well, I'd put it this way. I'm always looking for Galileos who can challenge the sacred cows of different fields of knowledge. I have a belief that so much, and you can correct me how you see it too, but so much of settled science is really more social science than it is actual hard science, in terms of we don't touch this hypothesis because prestigious scientists and institutions for some time have held to this paradigm, and therefore it's untouchable by its credentialed enshrinement. And so that's more of a social phenomenon rather than does the data really support such strong adherence to this existing paradigm for our bodies, for illnesses, and so forth. So I'm always looking for a Tesla and a Galileo and a heretic who really wants to just follow the data and isn't driven by some big giant food lobby or something. So I'm sure, do you have any giant food lobbies backing you?
I don't. I mean, that would be nice, but I don't. It's just me.
Right. Well, very good.
Yeah, so that gives me an idea about where to start. So sure, in terms of settled science. So there's as you probably know, there's this kind of international dogma around, I guess what I don't even know what you would call it, but the Ancel Keys kind of idea of the world. Ancel Keys was a nutritionist from the 50s and 60s and 70s, and he promoted the idea that of the Mediterranean diet, the idea that we should be eating lower fat diets, that the fats we're eating should be very unsaturated, polyunsaturated or monounsaturated at least. And he was thinking that way because he felt like those things were less likely to give you heart disease. His concern was not obesity back then, it was heart disease. Mm-hmm. And so he was not a very good scientist, in my opinion. He was kind of an epidemiologist, but he was a very forceful person in the media. And he was able to get his opinions obviously circulated widely, despite the fact that he didn't have really a lot of science backing him. Obviously, the global, media networks, doctors, etc., took his advice to heart. And so that's the environment that we all grew up in, right? And so then and you mentioned yourself as well, as a young person, I struggled with obesity my whole life. And then I had success with low carb diets. I originally read the Atkins diet in like 2003 probably, or 2002. I first did what back then was called Atkins. It wasn't even called keto yet. And so,
wasn't Dr. Atkins pro saturated fat too, or did he not get into that as much? I don't remember.
He was very pro, I guess I would say he was very pro animal products. He was very pro butter and beef. He didn't get that much into the details of it. but he liked beef, he liked butter, absolutely. And so mostly for him, it was just avoid carbs. That's the whole diet. He wasn't particularly anti-vegetable oil, to my recollection. And so anyway, so as a young person, I did low carb, and it worked great. And as I get older, it's worked less effectively. And so that's where I started to dig in a little more. And I got into this blog called Hyperlipid, which is by a guy, Peter Dobrimilski. I'm sure I got his name wrong. And so his blog gets into some very deep science around the mitochondria and how that works, and the different effects that saturated fat have when you're burning them versus polyunsaturated fats when you're burning them. And so I've read his blog for a long time, but it's really dense and it's really technical. And even with my scientific background, I struggled to understand a lot of it until you learn all the specific jargon that he's using, and a lot of just things I just hadn't ever researched. I didn't know what they were. So I spent weeks, months really, going through it and learning all the jargon so that I could read the blog and stay up to date and know what was happening. And because I could always tell that he was really smart and he was onto something, but I hadn't really put it all together. And so anyways, as I was reading his blog, at one point, as it was all clicking, I had this kind of eureka moment, which has now made me sort of I've never been a fan of the Ansel Keys, or at least for a long time. I guess as a very young person I was, because I grew up in the United States in the 80s and 90s. So I assumed, I lived through the 90s low-fat craze, and, I ate Snackwell's cookies and crackers thinking that was going to help me lose weight because they were fat-free, right? And so I lived through that, and then I got low carb. And then as I was reading Hyperlipid, the author of the blog himself is very low carb, but I started to realize that if what he was saying was really true, it solved this problem that I'd had, which was that I knew, I'm also just a fan of just traditional diets. I read the Weston A. Price book years ago, but I also love the China Health Study, which is a really interesting collection of data. And I don't mean T. Colin Campbell, the paperback book that you'll see in bookstores. Throw that thing out. It's nonsense. But the actual original 800-page manuscript is just full of fascinating data. And it really shows that you can have a society where people are living primarily on starch and they're metabolically healthy. Now, you can argue that a diet that is 85% white rice is probably not delivering great protein quality. There's a lot of vitamins that are missing. They have a lot of other problems, I'm sure. But if we're just talking about metabolic health, if you are a person who was born into a starch eating society and you eat that your whole life, it looks like you remain metabolically healthy. And China isn't the only part of the world that suggests this. There's lots of places like the Blue Zone countries. It's just that I'm most familiar with China, so that's kind of my reference point. Anyway, while reading Hyperlipid and thinking about China and thinking about low carb as well, I kind of started to the ideas kind of merged into saying that, like, well, if the real root of this is the different types of fats, meaning saturated fats and polyunsaturated fats, and how those affect insulin signaling, then it actually makes sense, all these different scenarios, that, okay, if I'm overweight because my insulin signaling is messed up, then if I go on a low carb diet, I can lose weight because if I eat less carbs, I produce less insulin. So that makes sense. And but what I also knew, that if I was a Chinese person eating, like I say, 90% starch, their insulin signaling has no problems. So even though once my insulin signaling is messed up, removing the starch seems to help with the problem. Clearly, I knew that the Chinese starch eaters, they were fine. So it couldn't be the starch that causes the problem in the first place. That was my assumption. And so the thing that Peter on his blog talks about all the time is the difference in how vegetable oils and saturated fats are dealt with in the mitochondria. And he does a lot of good studies with mice where, like, if you feed them, this woman named Valerie Reeves, her thesis, she does an experiment where she feeds mice basically starch with stearic acid, which is a long chain 18 carbon saturated fat, and they get very, very lean. And so it's an example of feeding a combined diet of starch and fat, which is very similar to the American diet, except the American diet is starch with vegetable oil mostly. And so in this experiment, they fed, starch with vegetable oil or starch with saturated fat, and the mice given the starch and the saturated fat became leaner than the control mice who were just eating starch, and starch tend to stay very lean on starch, whereas the ones getting starch and vegetable oil got fat. And so that was very interesting to me, because I also know from my culinary background that, I went to the French Culinary Institute, and I know that people in France eat lots of butter and starch together, right? I mean, baguettes with cheese and croissants and things like this that are combining starch and saturated fat together, and those cultures stay lean. And so, I just kind of had this eureka moment of realizing that the issue, in my opinion, where things go wrong is if you eat too many of these polyunsaturated fats. I think that it sends your metabolism on the wrong track, and I think that's at the root of what screws up your insulin signaling in the first place.
So when you're looking at the epidemic of chronic illnesses and metabolic dysfunction in Western countries, particularly America, by the way, is France seeing an uptick in obesity or chronic illnesses?
So they are. So what's happened in France is they maintained that real traditional diet until maybe the early 80s, but from the 80s on, there's a steady rise in sunflower oil consumption specifically. So the French are now eating 2/3 as much vegetable oil as Americans do, and obesity is now steadily rising in France as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, the hard thing is that there are almost no countries who have totally resisted the increase in dietary vegetable oils. So around the world, vegetable oils are increasing and obesity is increasing. It would be nice if there was like somewhere that, that didn't increase their vegetable oil consumption as sort of a control group, but I don't really know of any other than, very small areas perhaps that we don't have great data about.
And the reason why they're switching to it is because they're eating more cheaper foods and processed foods and crackers and peanut butter and stuff like that.
Well, that's a big part of it, but the other reason is that everybody thinks that the polyunsaturated fats are going to protect you from cardiovascular disease. And I think a lot of people think also that there's this weird, it's like, well, if polyunsaturated fats protect us from cardiovascular disease, then it must also, be good for me metabolically. Saturated fat is probably more fattening. I think people just jump to these conclusions. The conclusion is basically, unsaturated or saturated fat bad, unsaturated fat good. And so I think people will avoid, if there's two products, right? If there's two crackers on the shelf and one is made with sunflower oil and the other one was made with beef tallow, the vast majority of consumers are going to pick up the one that says sunflower oil because they've been conditioned to think that's better for them. And so I think there's a duality to it. Yes, vegetable oils are cheap and they're great for food processing companies' bottom lines. Absolutely. But also, you know, consumers have been conditioned to look for exactly those products.
And just the name vegetable in the brand connote, you know, that is an assumption that we've built into our programming that, you know, vegetables are good. So it's a health food. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And obviously vegetable oils don't actually come from vegetables, they come from seeds.
Right.
And so there's that. And so what,
but people probably literally think, I mean, I'm not saying, people probably literally think when you think about vegetable oils, they probably think like broccoli being squeezed so hard that juices, oil come out or something. You know what I mean? It's probably what people think, you know.
Yeah, I don't know what people think about that, but you know, it's interesting. So and I'll throw another sideline kind of thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently, and I wrote about it in my last series of posts. But you know, the other thing that's happened is over the last 50 or 100 years, people's body temperatures have dropped, and there's a there's a lot of
is that climate change doing that?
No, well, so there's if you read, there hasn't been a lot written about it, but there's a really interesting study that just came out, and I need to look at it more, about a tribe living in, I think it was the Amazon somewhere, and they were eating a very traditional diet of like a very starch heavy diet in the Amazon of like things like manioc and plantain, and a store open near them where they could get, you know, whatever Western foods, I guess. Presumably one of those things being vegetable oil. And they said over a 16-year period, they also opened a medical center there. So they had really good, you know, medical data on this tribe. And they said that in over a 16-year period, the average body temperature dropped by 0.5 degree Fahrenheit, which is pretty significant, right? And worldwide, it looks like body temperatures have dropped. And so I was looking at a paper that I think it was a 2019 paper just the other day, and I'm going to write this up on my blog soon, upcoming. And they had this cool heat map where they took these mice and they did a photo where, you know, parts of the mice's body that are relatively cool are in blue and parts that are relatively warm are in orange or red. And you could see they had this one group of mice that had been fed margarine, and they had another group of mice that had been fed butter. And you could see that the mice fed the butter had significantly higher body temperatures than the mice fed the margarine. And in fact, they had a third group where it was like butter supplemented with certain omega-3s, and they actually even had the highest body temperature of all, which is interesting. But just the fact that the mice fed butter have significantly higher I shouldn't say metabolic rate, probably metabolic rate, but definitely body temperature than the mice fed the margarine. I think that alone is very interesting, right? That's a controlled experiment, and you can do it and you can demonstrate it. And that parallels exactly what's happened around the world, is that as vegetable oil consumption has increased, our body temperatures have dropped, which is sort of a proxy for your metabolic rate. You know, when your body temperature drops, you're probably burning less calories. And so, you know, people always talk about calories in, calories out. And it's like, oh, well, if you want to lose weight, you have to consume less calories. But the more that I think about it and the more I go on, I think, no, maybe we should be burning more calories instead of eating less calories. And so I'm doing a diet right now that it's a sort of a repeat of an old diet in a different context. And it involves alternate day feasting, because in my mind, feasting is something that increases your metabolic rate. which is, I think, the idea of feasting during a diet sounds counterintuitive, but it works really well for me.
So does that mean you fast one day and then feast the next, or you're
yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. It's
total water
alternate days.
fast
Uh,
or
yeah, I
coffee
call it
fast?
I call it wine fasting.
Yeah.
I drink wine. I drink wine in the evenings to get through the fast.
Yeah.
But that's it. But other than that, it's coffee in the morning and red wine. That's the whole day's eating plan.
And that's for all the antioxidants for both. That's all that is for, right?
No, that's just to keep me sane.
Yeah.
I need the caffeine and the
You're
alcohol.
doing mad science all day, right? You're like sipping wine, mad science, right? Rewriting the history of nutrition, right?
Right, exactly. And so, yeah, and so I'm trying to think, right? And so, okay, so how does this all work? Well, it turns out that, so we live, this is going to shock a lot of people, we live in an oxygenated atmosphere, right? Which is interesting because oxygen has the potential to be quite corrosive. You see that when things rust, you see that when things catch on fire, right? And so our bodies we had to evolve to live in an environment. The early Earth didn't have oxygen. Oxygen came as a result of the evolution of chloroplasts, or at least, yeah, the chloroplasts came later. But the point is, the oxygen came on the scene relatively recently, and we had to evolve ways of dealing with it. And so we have this whole internal system of antioxidants, enzymes like superoxide dismutase, and we have a thing called glutathione, and their whole job is to deal with the fact that sorry, my mom just called. I'm a little distracted there. That inevitably we do something called oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria, and it's this whole complicated thing where ultimately what happens is when we eat sugar or we eat fat, the electrons are in a sort of high energy state in the fat or in the carbohydrate, and in our mitochondria, that electron gets passed from this high energy state through this whole chain of reactions down to and it recombines with oxygen to make carbon dioxide. And in that process, a lot of energy is released. And so that's how we make our living, is using oxygen as a tool to release the energy from things like fat and carbohydrates. But an inevitable byproduct of this is we make these things called free radicals or reactive oxygen species. And these are things that are basically different versions of oxygen, and they have like they could be hydrogen peroxide is H2O2. There's one called superoxide, and that's an oxygen that has an additional electron, and it has a pair of unpaired electrons, and that makes it a lot more reactive than just regular oxygen. And so we have this whole antioxidant system built into us to deal with these reactive oxygen species. And I think that's another misnomer, is a lot of people think that that antioxidants come from plants, right? Or wine or coffee, but that's not at all true. And when you consume antioxidants, the way that your body reacts to that is by making less antioxidants of its own. Because the body is trying to achieve this balance between oxidation and reduction, which is the opposite of oxidation. The body most of the time wants to live in the middle. It wants to have a balance of oxidation and reduction. And there's a thing called oxidative stress, which is too much oxidation. And there's a thing called reductive stress, which is actually too little ability to oxidize. And reductive stress is just as bad as oxidative stress. And so our body wants to be in the middle. So like if you take a bunch of vitamin E, the end result is your body just makes less antioxidants. So it doesn't really, you're not really gaining much from consuming antioxidants
Mm-hmm.
in the grand scheme of things. And if you look at all the studies they've done with like vitamin E trying to prevent various diseases and stuff, they don't work. They've never worked. It's never worked, right? So this is this whole antioxidant thing that's out in the public, like all of the science shows that it doesn't work, and people still talk about it all the time.
Dietary antioxidant consumption, right?
Right. Because it's what your body wants is balance. And it has got a whole system of balancing it. There's a transcription factor called NRF2, which is very crucial in this. And I won't go all the way into it other than to say that NRF2 is a key player in all of this. And what happens is it's a transcription factor when the mitochondria, long story short, when the mitochondria burn saturated fat, it produces a lot more reactive oxygen species than when they're burning polyunsaturated fat, right? There's more oxidative pressure from burning saturated fat than polyunsaturated fat, which a lot of people think, oh, that sounds bad, right? We need more antioxidants. But that's not true. Our bodies have actually evolved to use those reactive oxygen species as a basic signaling compound. It's a message. It's a signal. And so, what is a mitochondria? Well, mitochondria used to be a free-living organism, and it was some kind of bacteria that got taken into another cell and came to live there. And somehow that cell grew into us. And so if you think about what happened on day one of that relationship, this bacteria, the mitochondria, is doing this very clever thing where it's figured out how to do this oxidative phosphorylation and get more energy from glucose. But in the process, it's making these reactive oxygen species. But the original bacteria, what it did was it just exported them all.
Mm-hmm.
So now it was just like releasing reactive oxygen species in the water around it, and as long as they didn't build up too much, it was no big deal, right? But now all of a sudden, that cell is inside of another cell. So that cell is now taking on what the mitochondria is giving off, these reactive oxygen species. And so the cell had to develop a system to deal with the fact that the mitochondria is inside of it releasing these free radicals. But what's interesting about that is that most sources of fat in the world are fairly saturated. And the mitochondria can burn either glucose or fats. And when the mitochondria is burning glucose, it doesn't give off a lot of reactive oxygen species. But when it's burning saturated fat, it does give off a lot of reactive oxygen species. And so when the nucleus of the cell sees a lot of reactive oxygen species being produced, that's how the nucleus knows what the mitochondria is doing. It's a signal to the nucleus that the cell is burning fat. So the nucleus of the cell sees, okay, reactive oxygen species, that means we're burning fat. We should react appropriately to the context that we're living on fat right now. And when it sees relatively little reactive oxygen species, it says, okay, now we're burning glucose. Now we need to act in an appropriate way to deal with the fact that we're burning glucose, right? Now, if we eat a lot of polyunsaturated fat, we're burning fat. We're not making much reactive oxygen species. The nucleus thinks, okay, we're burning glucose. And so
is the polyunsaturated fat mimicking glucose in the way it interacts in the cell, or?
I mean, I wouldn't say that I think the polyunsaturated fat is a fairly passive bystander in this. It simply breaks the signal. Like the cell doesn't know what's going on anymore once we start burning polyunsaturated fats.
And is that the case? Is that the case for like natural forms of it, like nuts and seeds? If you're chomping on sesame seeds or sunflower seeds and peanuts.
Yeah. So
Same kind of
So
thing.
there's a bit of a misnomer. Well, all kinds of fats, all fats are blends of saturated, unsaturated,
Right.
monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated, right?
Right.
And so when you look at the foods that are most often consumed, right? There are some that you've mentioned are more like sunflowers. Yeah, that's a new one that definitely would have been, that's almost all polyunsaturated, or it's like 70% polyunsaturated. I don't think eating large amounts of sunflower seeds is a great idea. But if we're talking about something like an almond is mostly monounsaturated fat. Same thing with an acorn. But I'll let you in on a little story. So this is a world premiere. This little factoid that I've recently uncovered.
We
So
need to
I
be
found
eating
two
acorns. Are you about to break news? We need to eat acorns.
Native Americans on both the east and west coast of the U.S. ate a lot of acorns traditionally. Um, Acorns are mostly starch, and they have a small amount of fat, which is mostly monounsaturated fat, but they also have significant, perhaps 20% polyunsaturated fat. And some acorns are oilier than other ones. So some of them are only 5% oil, and some of them are like 20% oil. And I find the Native Americans to be a really interesting case study because the California Native Americans didn't have agriculture at all. They were pure hunter gatherers, and except for perhaps tobacco. And the East Coast Native Americans had corn and squash and beans, and they ate corn, but they only ate corn for about half of the year. They weren't a fully Neolithic group. They still got probably 70% of their calories from hunting and gathering. So they used corn, but only, they used domesticated crops, but it was definitely less than half of their calories. Um, and so they're an interesting kind of transitional group between hunter gatherers and Neolithic people. Anyway, they both ate acorns,
They
and
boiled them, or what did they do to eat them? They just
yes, so they did different things on the east and west coast, but I found two separate references that one in California, what they would do, the other problem with acorns is they have tannins, so they're bitter. And so in California, what they would do is they would make like a basket, and they would put it next to a stream, and they would put their crushed acorns in there, and they would run water through it, and that would remove the tannins. Um, the reference that I found said that if the acorns were oily, they would use boiling water to get rid of the tannins, and the boiling water would remove the oil from the acorns. And so the Native Americans knew that if they were eating oily acorns, they should use hot water to get rid of the vegetable oil. Back on the East Coast, the traditional method of cooking acorns was to boil them for, quote, and I found several references that said this, for, quote, half the day. I don't really know how long that is, if that means 12 hours or if that means like half the workday, like 4 hours. But anyways, they boiled them for a very long time, and then they skimmed the fat off the top. And they would use the acorn oil as like a lotion. But on both coasts, people were going through what I would call extra measures to remove the acorn oil.
and that was the polyfat, or is that the mono?
Those are about 20% polyunsaturated, largely monounsaturated, and very little saturated fat in there, right? And so you've got two different groups of people going out of their way, and they both knew to do this, right? I don't know how long the West Coast and East Coast Native Americans have been separated, but probably 10,000 years. And on both coasts, they were removing the oil. And it's not that they were averse to combining fat and oil, because there's another recipe on the East Coast where they would take acorn meal and they would add bear fat to it, and then they would bake it into these cakes. And so East Coast Native Americans were literally making acorn flour, boiling it, removing the vegetable oil, adding bear fat to it, and then baking it and eating it.
So they're
That's a
replacing
lot.
the inferior fat with the better fat, right?
Right. And they knew to do that. They just knew, right? Presumably through long experience.
Now, wait a second. What about like the theory I've heard that, these polyunsaturated fats tell your body to store and expand the cells for fat
Right.
because it's winter. So why would they eat that fat if it's wintertime? And they're like, okay, we don't want to remove this oil. This will help us keep on a little layer of fat for this harsh winter.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there was a seasonal change. There's not, unfortunately, there's not as many, sort of English language references, direct references from back then. It's possible that seasonally they would have changed it. Or it's possible that they just realized for other reasons that the acorn oil was just inferior and they didn't want anything to do with it. So I don't have a great answer to that question. But as to your point, yes, about, okay, so I've argued that on average, these polyunsaturated fats will cause fat gain. And the reason is that so when you're consuming polyunsaturated fats, or when you're burning polyunsaturated fats, I should say, in the mitochondria, and this is an important point, is that what you're burning in your mitochondria is a blend of fat that came in from your last meal plus your stored body fat. And that is that's a crucial point. We can come back to it, but any given moment, if your mitochondria are burning these polyunsaturated fats, you're not making a lot of reactive oxygen species. What the reactive oxygen species do is they actually shut off insulin signaling if you're making a lot of them in your, specifically I'm talking about now, in your fat cells. So if energy levels are pretty high, you've got blood sugar, you've got plenty of fat, free fatty acids, which is how the energy moves through the body. The fat cells have their store. If you've just eaten a meal, there's all these signals that the fat should start doing metabolism for the energy needs of the cell, and the more and more the energy builds up, so now your ADP is becoming ATP, your NAD NAD plus is becoming NADH. The energy levels of the cell are rising, and the more reactive oxygen species you create in this, basically the higher the energy level in the cell is, and the more saturated the fat is, the more ATP you create, the more reactive oxygen species you create. And those reactive oxygen species shut down insulin signaling. So insulin is a signal that the cell should be taking up energy. Insulin is a signal that calories have come in from the diet. You eat, your body creates insulin. It's a signal to the cells like, okay, take in this energy that you just ate, right? That's what insulin, that's the job of insulin. And so the faster that your fat cells become insulin resistant, the faster they stop storing fat. And when they stop storing fat, then your blood levels of fat and calories start to rise, and that becomes a hypothalamic signal to stop eating, right? That's how our hypothalamus is judging satiety, or satiety is based on how many macronutrients are available to it. It's looking at blood glucose levels, it's looking at blood fat levels, things like ketones, and so basically if your fat cells are very insulin sensitive, as dietary fat from the meal comes in, they're just going to keep storing it and storing it and storing it, and then the levels in the hypothalamus never get high enough, and that satiety is never signaled, and you just keep storing it and storing it. Conversely, if your fat cells are burning saturated fat, they make a lot of reactive oxygen species, and they just say no to insulin, stop storing it, and then this whole chain of events is sort of triggered off of that initial event. and you stop eating and you stop storing the fat. The hypothalamus also uses reactive oxygen species directly as a signal that triggers satiety. So if your hypothalamus is burning polyunsaturated fat, you're not going to get that same satiety signal as if the hypothalamus is taking in saturated fat. And so it kind of works on this whole idea that reactive oxygen species are a very basic low-level signal that's telling the body about its energy levels. Happens on, in multiple places. It's happening in fat cells, it's happening in muscle cells, and it's happening in the hypothalamus.
And the PUFA is scrambling, the polyunsaturated fat is scrambling all the signals on all those different cells, or only on the fat cells?
Yes, it is.
All the cells. Okay.
Right. So the hypothalamus absolutely uses reactive oxygen species to signal satiety or satiety. So the hypothalamus is looking for these reactive oxygen species to tell it to signal, okay, you're full now. And the polyunsaturated fats don't generate nearly the same amount of reactive oxygen species as saturated fat. So you're going to get the fullness signal way quicker if the hypothalamus is getting saturated fats rather than unsaturated fats.
What about glucose, though? You said glucose doesn't produce reactive oxidative species, right? So would that not also create a similar problem of signaling for satiety? Is that why people eat bags of Cheetos, right?
Well, it does, and so it's a little different because, like I said, so most of the time the cell is in. There's a thing called the Randle cycle, and what the Randle cycle does is in any given cell, it switches it back and forth from oxidizing glucose to oxidizing fat, or vice versa. And there's a lot of things that affect that. But at the end of the day, any one cell is typically doing one thing or the other because of the Randle cycle. And so when the cell is in glucose burning mode, presumably it would be doing different things to signal satiety than when it's in fat burning mode, right? The problem is that when you eat polyunsaturated fats, the cell doesn't know what it's doing. It thinks it's burning glucose, but it's not. It's burning fat. And so the cells fail to react appropriately to the context of the Randle cycle being on the fat burning side of the equation. Does that make sense? And so like you would do, if you know that you're burning glucose, you would produce different signals, you'd produce different nuclear proteins, different enzymes that are going to make your whole metabolism work in a different way than if you're burning fat. And so there's a whole downstream, a lot of things happen as a result.
So are you suggesting that the body knows how to handle digest or metabolically using glucose better than it does PUFAs at the level that we're eating them? I'm
saying the body can handle starch very well.
Fructose. Is that a whole other topic?
Fructose is another topic. I'm going to punt on that for now. I think the body knows how to handle starch pretty well. I think the body knows how to handle something like animal fat very well. And the sort of normal saturated to unsaturated ratios. Beef fat, most people would be surprised if I said beef fat has more monounsaturated fat than saturated fat, but it does. So most of our traditional, I would argue that humans at some point in their fairly recent past were largely carnivorous. And I would argue that most fat that you get from meat is mostly monounsaturated. It's more monounsaturated than it is saturated. I wouldn't even argue that. That's just a
And
fact.
does monounsaturated fat produce the reactive oxidative species?
So
Okay.
this is actually getting in. So I just wrote a series called the SCD1 theory of obesity, and part 3 of that series deals with this exact question. So what happens when you consume monounsaturated fat is really interesting. If you were to eat something like olive oil, that's way too unsaturated to store straight olive oil. You would totally screw up your metabolism if you did that. You simply cannot store olive oil as body fat. It just wouldn't work. It'd be a mess. And so the body knows when it sees olive oil coming in, okay, I can't just store this. I need to somehow saturate it. And so in your intestine, in response to that 18 carbon monounsaturated fat called oleic acid, named after olive oil, it makes a molecule called OEA. It has a much longer name that I'm not going to try to pronounce while we're recording. But this OEA is a signal, and what it does is it actually upregulates a lot of things in your fat metabolism. So it upregulates lipolysis in fat cells. So lipolysis is the process by which the fat cells release fat to the rest of the body as fuel. So your fat cells start releasing fat. Your liver starts producing fat via de novo lipogenesis. So your liver starts producing fat from any glucose it can get. So like if you eat pasta with olive oil, your body senses all of this incoming monounsaturated fat, and it's like, okay, we gotta get on this. What it starts doing is it starts turning that starch into saturated fat and mixing it with the monounsaturated fat from the olive oil. And so what you see is fat just starts moving around everywhere. Fat cells are releasing it. The liver is taking it up. It's adding saturated fat to it. It's re-releasing it. And everybody's OEA also signals to fat cells to start burning fat. And so the monounsaturated fat it's very interesting what this OEA does. It basically is like, okay, we need to saturate this fat. And the liver, so the body can only make saturated fat from starch, right? We can't make polyunsaturated fat. And the amount of monounsaturated fat that we can make is totally determined by an enzyme called SCD1. And so the other thing that OEA does is it downregulates SCD1 quite dramatically. And so in the absence of SCD1, all of the fat produced in the liver from starch is saturated. And so you eat olive oil, the liver just starts cranking out saturated fat to combine with the olive oil to get the relative saturation level of that fat up to a level where we can safely store it. But we can't store it without first saturating it. And so the body does upregulate fat oxidation by activating something called CPT1, and that kind of regulates how fast fat can go in the mitochondria. And so the olive oil, so the body just starts trying to burn off all of this monounsaturated fat, and at the same time it's converting the starch to saturated fat, and at the same time the fat cells are releasing the saturated fat that they have to mix with the olive oil. And so it's this whole systematic approach to like, okay, we're eating a lot of these monounsaturated fats. We need to fix it, right? We have to deal.
So it doesn't prefer monounsaturated fats; it prefers saturated fat, or what's the hierarchy of preference of fuel for the body, as you can understand it?
I mean, I guess
because you said beef has both saturated fat and monounsaturated fat.
Right, beef has more monounsaturated fat than it has saturated fat. Most of it. There's different. So, and that's interesting because people say, well, beef fat. Well, beef fat is a lot of different things. If we're talking about ribeye fat, or what you get in ground beef, it has more monounsaturated fat than saturated fat. If we're talking about bone marrow, which was definitely eaten by a lot of ancient peoples, bone marrow has almost as much monounsaturated fat as olive oil. So bone marrow is a very, rich source of monounsaturated fat. Conversely, if we're talking about a ruminant and we're looking at kidney fat, which is also known as beef suet, that fat around the organs is highly, highly saturated. Much more, it's like 70% saturated fat, which is much more saturated than any other animal source of fat that I know of. And so, yeah, I think we can't just say, I mean, if we say beef fat, I think we're talking about, the kind of skeletal fat that you would find in ground beef, right? And that fat is more monounsaturated than saturated. But I think that I shouldn't even say that. I want to say that this whole pattern of responding to OEA was probably in human evolution to deal with eating large amounts of bone marrow. And I talk about this again in my last series, but there's evidence that Africans were eating basically these native tubers to Africa, roasting them over fires in caves 170,000 years ago. And in these same caves, you have tons of bone shards where people were collecting, bone marrow. And so to me, I believe that, 170,000 years ago, people were eating starch and bone marrow together, which is to say starch and monounsaturated fat together.
And were they eating the starch as a preference for taste, or were they eating it because it was survival food and that kind of filled out the fact that they didn't have quite enough animal fat to satisfy their tribe or whatever?
I mean, I don't know why they did it. I don't necessarily buy into the argument of tubers are survival food. I think that tubers had some issues, but I also think that people seem to live quite happily on things like potatoes, right? But potatoes have problems. They're toxic at first until you domesticate them, and you need to cook them, right? Potatoes are not digestible raw, and so these early humans had figured out a way to control fire and keep it going, and they had begun to roast their meat probably, and they realized that, these tubers, which are not very edible when raw, if we roast them in our fire, suddenly we have these nice potato-like tubers, and the tubers found in Africa were as starchy. In fact, looking at the paper, it seems like they're actually more starchy than a potato, so and less fibrous.
Like a
and
proto yam or something totally different.
Yeah, I mean they still grow wild in Africa. I'm trying to find someone to
What's it
go to a
called?
market.
The tuber that was found.
It's off the top of
Does
my
it
head.
look like a yam? Or what does it have a different color?
They're small. They're like maybe an inch and a half across. They look like a little just like a little root vegetable, But I guess they're very starchy, and you can still buy them. I guess they still have them at wild harvested ones that you can buy in certain farmers markets in Africa. So we, in theory, if we had the right connection, we could just have somebody send us some and try them. But I haven't found that connection yet. But I'm very curious about them. So that's on my to-do list.
You know what the name is of them?
Off the top of my head, I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like the wild African potato or something. But there's two of them, and one is more for medicinal purposes, and the other one has the nice tubers, and they're part of the same genus, I think. So if you Google tubers Africa cave 170,000 years ago, the reference will come right up, and the author of the paper in a separate article talks about the what they think the tubers are and what the nutritional value of the tubers are. So I think to me that's a very interesting story, because I think that once when you look at how did the various peoples, right, around the globe as they moved out of Africa, like you had the Neanderthals in Europe, who, to my knowledge, my understanding, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I don't think they had necessarily domesticated fire in the same way that the humans coming out of Africa did. But ultimately, Homo sapiens replaced, all of the other humans that were already living there, right? And probably they did so because fire gave them access to these tubers that were more of a year-round supply of food, and that they could, they were better able to basically outlast them in a time of shortage of game or something else, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of what allowed humans maybe to displace, this is my working theory, that fire and the ability to roast tubers would have given Homo sapien a big survival advantage against other humans that we were competing with for resources at the time.
But because you didn't have to be so dependent on animals coming and going and stuff, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And we know that humans were devastating hunters, and that they, most of the animals that were around, I mean, when you think about what happened in North America, animals that had survived 10 ice ages, mm-hmm. and then humans got here, and they were all gone like in the blink of an eye. The mammoths, the mastodons, the giant ground sloths. There were lots of others. And, humans got here, and 2,000 years later, they were all gone. Right?
Yeah. And so humans love fatty animals.
No, they do.
The Steller sea cow. They tore that thing apart as soon as they got a hold of it. Remember? The giant manatee thing? You think that tasted like a ribeye, like times 100, or what do you think? Why were they tearing into that thing so much, man?
They love it. No. Humans love fatty meat. That's clear, and clearly that's what drove a lot of movement of peoples around the world. But we also were probably too clever by half, and our skill set and our cleverness allowed us to actually exterminate all of the things that we really wanted to eat, right? That's kind of what happened.
So we've doomed our nutrition in some sense.
perhaps. But I also think that when you look at someone like the French, I mean, they do okay eating potatoes and starch,
There's a lot of people cheering for you right now about your hypothesis for optimal nutrition being correct, because the idea of eating a baked potato with butter and a big ribeye is heaven for people. And yet that's the most demonized category of foods, because you got the keto low carb guys hating on the potato, and you got the mainstream guys hating on the steak and butter. And you're like, no, that's the gold standard, perhaps. I mean, I don't know if that's what you're saying, but
I mean, one of my favorite movie clips is there's a movie called The Road to Wellville. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's really funny if you're into nutrition. It's about George Kellogg. He had he's the guy who created Kellogg's Corn Flakes, and he was basically a vegetarian activist, and he had this wellness camp in Michigan, and so all these rich people would come in to get healthy at his wellness clinic. And it's a really funny movie. It's got John Cusack and a lot of good actors. And anyway, there's a scene in the movie when one of his sons, who's kind of a little off kilter, revolts against dad, and he just stands up at the dinner table, and he says, "We want proper food, meat and potatoes, meat and potatoes." And he starts like banging his spoon against his plate and just chanting meat and potatoes. So anyway. Yeah, but right. I mean, it's classic meat and potatoes. We all know that. And the thing is, that worked for a really long time. And I've got the USDA Yearbook of Agriculture from 1939, where it goes through extensive detail of exactly what the traditional American diet was. And it was absolutely starch, and potatoes and butter and pork fat and meat all consumed together, right? Like that's what people ate. And sure, you can argue that, well, on the homestead, they were doing tough agricultural work and they were burning a lot of calories. But what's also clearly true is that a lot of them moved to the cities. And if you look at pictures of New York City from the 1960s, for instance, you can see that everyone in those pictures is very slim, certainly compared to the average person that you'd see on a city scene today. And we know from the USDA records, from menus of the time, we know that they were all eating flour and potatoes and butter. Those three things was the basis of that diet. They also, of course, ate meat and milk and vegetables and other things. But if you look at workaday menus in New York from the early part of the 1900s, you know, I have this great one from a diner, and it's like milk toast is on the menu. Milk toast is like 2 pieces of toast with cinnamon and sugar on it that they like pour whole milk over and give you in a bowl. That was the most expensive thing on the menu, but the whole menu is that way. One of the other menu items was crackers and milk. And so, you know, but that's like what the working people in American cities were eating in the early part of the 1900s. And, you know, by the 1960s, okay, people in New York are still very slim, and they're eating toast, and they're riding the subway to work. They're taking a cab. They're taking the elevator up to their office, right? They're not out laboring in the fields. And yet they're still very slim. And so why? And then what changed? And, you know, I think that it was the wide-scale introduction of vegetable oils in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And I'll go one further. I think that obesity has become an even bigger, faster encroaching problem in the last 20 years. This is going to be a very controversial thing to say, but one of the things that happened was 20-ish years ago, we outlawed hydrogenation. Now, hydrogenation of vegetable oils creates a lot of problems, such as trans fats, and I'm not arguing in favor of trans fats, but hydrogenation also turns significant amounts of the polyunsaturated vegetable oils into stearic acid. The whole point of hydrogenation is to make the vegetable oils more saturated so that they're firmer and you can use them in a deep fryer, right, without them turning to like shellac. Because the problem, the polyunsaturated bonds, they all oxidize. So like if you put straight soybean oil into a deep fryer, it basically turns into this like, it turns into like not paint or shellac, because the same reactions are happening where like that happen underground when little creatures turn into petroleum. You know, you get these longer chains of fats that are making like, you know, like grease that you burn in your, or whatever, that you lube your car with, right? Same thing happens in a vegetable fryer with soybean oil. So I would argue that, in fact, the partially hydrogenated soybean oils, purely, not necessarily from a, like something like heart disease, but purely for metabolic health, they might have been better because they were a lot more saturated. They had more stearic acid in them. And just recently we've switched from those to now just straight up PUFA. And that's something that's happened in the last 20 years. And, you know, to me, it seems like children on average are more obese than they were when I was a kid in the 80s. You know, this isn't meant to be me arguing in favor of partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. This is me arguing in favor of saturated fats versus polyunsaturated fats. And so, yeah, like I think that something like beef fat or beef suet even is a much better choice than soybean oil or
As for all overall health, is there any other thing you're worried about with beef fat?
I mean, that's for overall health. I mean, look, beef fat is also a source of things like vitamin K2. Butter is an even better source of vitamin K2. I think vitamin K2 is a really important, underrated nutritional thing. Vitamin K2 that basically has two jobs that we know of. One is to direct calcium out of your arteries, and the other is to direct calcium into your bones. And so, we've heard a lot about increasing amounts of osteoporosis and increasing amounts of arterial calcification. And both of those things could be a result of switching from butter and beef fat and lard, all of which contain vitamin K2, to primarily vegetable oils, which don't contain any vitamin K2. And so, there are other health benefits to, I'll say, animal sourced fats, because cocoa butter is just as saturated as any animal fat, but it doesn't have the vitamin K2, and it doesn't have some of the other unique long chain. I'm not against all polyunsaturated fats. CLA, people have probably heard of, conjugated linoleic acid.
Yeah, people take it as a supplement. Yeah.
Right. And that's actually, interestingly, a trans fat. But it does a lot of benefit for metabolic health. And when you're eating butter, you're getting CLA. When you're eating chocolate, you're getting way, way less, if any. So even though chocolate has a great, and I recommend cocoa butter.
For what? For heating and cook, like heating it up and eating it, or what do you do with that?
Yeah, I mean, people just eat it. You buy those little wafers, and people just eat it as just to control hunger. And it's a pure fat, so it doesn't really stimulate insulin. People put it in their coffee. They melt it in their coffee instead of cream. I'm generally in favor of cocoa butter, but having said that, cocoa butter does lack some of the things that animal fats have, such as vitamin K2 and such as things like CLA.
So given that we're not in a survival mode where we have to worry about herds coming and going, is it not optimal to, primarily eat a carnivorous heavy diet? I mean, because one of the things, because I know you do the croissant diet, which is to prove a point, more importantly, that, you can have starches like a flour with a stearic acid heavy type butter or pancakes or whatever, and still lose weight, which is something we haven't got into too much yet. But optimally speaking, since so many people in America and so forth are carrying around a lot of PUFAs in their body and they want to get rid of them, is it optimal to just eliminate starches until you've drained your body of the excess amount of PUFAs over a few years? And then if you want to do it the best way, then start adding the starches and carbs and stuff back in? Or how do you see that?
I think that's correct. I think that, so I think a lot about what's the blend of the fuel as it's going into the mitochondria, right? That ultimately is the thing. So if you've been eating tons of PUFA, and that's what your stored fat is, and then you eat, whatever, you eat a croissant. Now, you're getting saturated fat from the croissant, but that's all blending with your stored PUFA as it goes in the mitochondria, so it might not get you the desired result. Furthermore, the other problem that most Americans have, and this again goes back to my recent series of posts, the SCD1 theory of obesity, is that we make too much of this enzyme called SCD1, and what it does is it converts your stored saturated fat, mostly your stearic acid, into monounsaturated fat, oleic acid, and that's all it does. It just unsaturates your saturated fats. And for whatever reason, obese people make way too much of it. So when you look at obese people in America and you just look at their fat content, they have more PUFA than a lean person, and they have more monounsaturated fat than a lean person. The PUFA is dietary. The monounsaturated fat is because they're making too much of this enzyme. And so if you're obese, you are likely to have very unsaturated body fat. And so
is that
so
is
you
that
have
is that because they're obese or because they have a genetic makeup that creates that kind of outcome in the presence of the PUFA consumption? Because there's a lot of
well,
people that eat PUFAs and they're thin. So why is that?
clearly, I don't really have the answer to that other than say that obviously there's a wide range of physiologies in the world, right? And obviously, sure, everybody knows that guy. I certainly do. I know the guy who can eat. There's a local restaurant here, and they have what's called the Pines Burger Challenge, and you have to eat 4 cheeseburgers with the buns and 4 servings of fries, and they're generous portions. And you have to eat 4 of them, and you get on the plaque, and you get a T-shirt if you eat all 4 burgers and all 4 plates of fries. My friend Devin set the world record. He did it in under 7 minutes. Devin will order an entire large pizza and eat it in one sitting, and he's lean. That's just Devin.
Does that mean?
I call it the Devin metabolism.
I guess what I'm saying is that people who have who store fat in the presence of the excess PUFAs that everybody's eating, is that a deficiency, or is it actually a sign of optimal genetics because it's designed to do what would happen in ancient times or whatever when it's winter's coming and you're chewing on seeds and nuts, and therefore you're going to make it in the winter, and the guy who can eat burgers and fries today would not survive that because his body's not going to keep the fat on more efficiently? Or is there no way to determine that?
Yeah, that's an interesting argument, and I don't have a really great response to it, other than to say that clearly there are large genetic differences in people's proclivities to store fat in the modern food environment, which may or may not be a good thing. Sort of as you point out, like if you're eating a lot of, when we think about obesity becoming diabetes, what happens is, well, and I'm taking this theory directly from Peter at Hyperlipid. His opinion is that what happens is becoming obese is a protective mechanism for a while. If you're consuming too many calories for whatever reason, and I would argue in the case of overeating vegetable oils, it's because your satiety is messed up and you're making too much insulin and these problems start happening. So you gain weight, and at first, the fact that you can squirrel away the extra calories as body fat actually maintains your overall organismal insulin sensitivity. It kind of keeps the whole thing working, right? But then at some point, your fat cells become so distended that they're actually physically incapable of holding in the fat anymore. Like they can only make that structure, that superstructure that holds the fat in so big, and this other enzyme comes into play, and they start just literally releasing the fat. They just physically can't store anymore, right? And so what happens sometimes as you transition from being obese to being diabetic because you've lost the ability to get any fatter. And then what happens is your free fatty acids start to rise because your fat cells just can't hold it in. Now your blood has all this extra circulating fat circulating in it that it doesn't want or need. That's when you truly become diabetic. And so there's an argument to be made that a person who remains lean in the context of polyunsaturated fats in the diet might stay lean, but they might also be more prone to becoming diabetic. And in fact, that's exactly what we see in places like India. Indians have started to eat lots of vegetable oils, And they're becoming one of the most, India is one of the highest prevalences of diabetes on the planet, but they're not obese, right? And so they do have abdominal obesity, but they don't store fat on their backs like certainly Europeans tend to. And so the inability to store fat on their backs probably makes Indians more likely to ultimately get diabetes. So, the fact that they're not getting hugely obese is good from a, the perspective of how you look or how you're judged by your peers, but it might also predispose you to getting diabetes quicker in the presence of a bad diet.
So is it possible that people who tend to be more likely to gain a lot of weight in the presence of eating a lot of PUFAs are actually like genetically more able to deal with it better than maybe they were in a northern, wet, colder climate or something, and or southern hemisphere,
I
climate?
would say so. Yeah, and it's exactly what you're saying. It's like, well,
because Native Americans have obesity problems now that they're eating, the fry bread cooked in vegetable oils, right, and Crisco.
Right,
stuff,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
But they weren't obese when they were eating bear fat and acorns, like you were talking about. So,
right, exactly. And so you see, right, and so you see this example all over the world of like, yes, when these vegetable oil comes in, and the Native Americans are a perfect example, people become obese. I mean, it's happening globally right now. Every country in the world has rising rates of vegetable oil in parallel with obesity, where the obesity wasn't there,
So is
40 years ago.
obesity really the telltale sign of unhealth, or is it just the scapegoat for indicator of something that's happening to everybody? And some people are popping up fat with the garbage food of PUFA, and some people are hiding it, and then they have diseases later. So is it a scapegoat for for dysfunctional health? Not that you shouldn't be concerned about it, obviously, but that it's a symptom of something, not the underlying concern of what's going on. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that obesity, or at least the ability to gain weight, is protective for a while. You can't continue gaining weight forever, right? Yeah, but no, I think that for a time, gaining weight is a protective thing. Absolutely.
Protective from linoleic acid? Or no? Not.
Yeah, I get what I mean is protective of ultimately becoming diabetic.
Okay.
So
interesting.
Yeah. I think like I say, I think the root cause of that is ultimately the consumption of too much linoleic acid.
So would you,
in the first place,
not to go off too much, but would you just discourage people from eating nuts and seeds if they're young as a kid, just to stay away from it, since there's so many PUFAs and everything? I mean, obviously we know, the soybean oil, canola oil, peanut butter is worse, but should you just generally avoid them? And because I know they're found, in small amounts and animal fats and so forth too, but is it best just to avoid nuts and seeds, generally speaking?
I think
those
so.
are treated as health foods. Canola oil is still controversial whether it's health or not, for people. But
right, yeah, and
people in low carb and keto circles are guzzling, almond oil and almond flour, and I mean, I know you said that's not as bad as others, but
it's not as bad as others. My argument would be that if you're metabolically healthy, you can probably get away with eating some almonds. And, like I say, if you're strictly avoiding carbs, you're making less insulin, you can probably have some almonds and it's okay. But to me, if you're someone who's struggling with obesity, which is probably why you became keto in the first place, I definitely don't recommend nuts. My mother, who's also always struggled with her weight, and she's been on a fairly strict low carb diet recently, but she always has nuts out, and like to me they're very triggering. Like I'll eat them when I'm at her house. Like I can't stop myself. You know what I mean? And they don't trigger any kind of satiety. I can just eat them all day. And when I started talking about this, I've heard a lot of people in keto circles saying like, yeah, I definitely stall on keto once I introduce nuts. And so I don't recommend them personally. And that's partially just logically thinking about the different fats and how they work. And that's just partially been my experience.
So if you're doing keto and you really want to have good success, you got to eliminate nuts and seeds, generally speaking. And I mean, I guess you could get into pistachio and hazelnut. I don't know. I don't have, but generally, if you want to speak up for a nut, that's okay. You can throw it out there, give it a shout out. But I guess you said almonds, right? Is that your favorite of the nuts in terms of health?
Out of the favorite of the nuts, out of my favorite out of the nuts would be macadamia nuts.
In terms of health or taste?
In terms of health, that's because they have the lowest amount of polyunsaturated fats. They're only like 3 to 5% polyunsaturated fat, not that much higher than butter. And they have a lot of, they're mostly oleic acid, which is the monounsaturated, but they actually have a lot of palmitoleic acid as well. And one of the things palmitoleic acid does is it helps to suppress SCD1, the gene that sort of works against you by unsaturating your own fat. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, out of all of them, I would go with macadamia nuts.
Do you want to avoid olive oil consumption a lot and stuff like that? Olives and
I do. I avoid them.
Why?
I do.
Because of too much monounsaturated fat? Because of SCD1? Is that what that's?
Yes, too much monounsaturated fat. I mean, so
because a lot of people take olive oil as sacred too in keto worlds and other worlds too. But.
Sure. Yeah. No. Of course. And so olive oil or the SCD1 story is really interesting because like basically if you take anything and you generate too much SCD1 in it, it will become fat. Like if you take a muscle cell in a culture dish and the only thing you do is overexpress SCD1, it will just start taking fat out of culture and storing it as primarily monounsaturated fat. If a hibernating animal needs to store fat, they make more SCD1. That's how they do it. That's the whole trick. Like if your fat is sort of sufficiently saturated, you do what's called uncoupling. So I started to tell the story before, and I think I got off track, but when I mentioned the NRF1 and the transcription factors and the fats responding to ROS. Okay, so your mitochondria starts making a lot of ROS. What happens? It activates a transcription factor called NRF2. NRF2 goes into the nucleus, and it does a lot of things, but one of the things it does is it can stimulate production of uncoupling proteins. And what uncoupling proteins do is they allow you to burn off energy as heat, as opposed to storing it as ATP, as opposed to storing it for energy to use later. The uncoupling proteins, they literally just burn off stored energy as heat. And this is called thermogenesis. And this is what leptin is a hormone that's made by your fat cells. What it's supposed to do is increase the rate of fat oxidation in the mitochondria, which is supposed to release a wave of reactive oxygen species, which is supposed to activate NRF2, which is supposed to induce thermogenesis by upregulating things like uncoupling proteins. And this all happens in your fat cells. So humans can do what's called beiging of our fat cells, which is mice have a thing called brown adipose tissue, which is a type of fat. And the reason that it's brown is it's so dense with mitochondria, and mitochondria look dense. And so they're burning tons of fat. Brown adipose tissue, that's all it does. It just burns fat and it creates heat. Mice have a problem where they have a low, compared to humans anyways, they have a lot of surface area and not a lot of volume. And so it's really easy for their body temperature to drop because, if they go outside, it's cold, they're giving off tons of heat and they just don't have that much mass. And so they have more of this brown adipose tissue. They have more ability to turn on the furnace and crank out a bunch of heat from stored fat. But humans, we can do what's called beiging of our white adipose tissue, which is just normal fat. And beiging just means we're making more mitochondria, we're doing more fat oxidation, we're uncoupling more, and we're just simply burning off stored heat as fat. Mm-hmm. And so that ties together the story about everyone's body temperature dropping. You know, I would argue that one of the reasons our body temperatures have dropped is that if our stored body fat isn't saturated enough, we can't generate enough reactive oxygen species to do thermogenesis. We can't really activate the NRF2 enough to make the uncoupling proteins and to make the whole process of building more mitochondria, burning more fat, and releasing more heat. And that's one of the reasons that you see everyone's body temperature drop. And so this thermogenesis is a really protective mechanism against obesity. This is, in fact, the inbuilt mechanism that we have to prevent obesity. Leptin, the whole job of leptin is to prevent obesity. And most, well, not really most, but all obese humans are what they call leptin resistant. And so our leptin has stopped working for some reason. And I think the reason that the leptin has stopped working is that the way that leptin does its job is by increasing the rate of fat oxidation. And what that's supposed to do is it's supposed to lead to this state of thermogenesis where we're just simply burning more calories. But if you eat too much vegetable oil and if you make too much SCD1, your fat's too unsaturated, you can't produce the reactive oxygen species, you can't uncouple, and you can't do thermogenesis. And so we've lost the ability to simply burn off extra calories, which is how we're designed, I think. I think we're designed that if we have a period of feasting, you know, I think that's supposed to be okay. Like seasonally, you know, you look at a lot of cultures, like, you know, they go through these feasting seasons, right? And that's okay. What happens? So let's say, you know, if we're a Chinese peasant and it's harvest season, right? And we have all these festivals, we're, you know, eating rice, we're drinking rice wine, you know, we probably pack on a few pounds, right? But since we can't make polyunsaturated fat from the starch in the white rice, all of the fat that we store on our bodies is going to be very saturated. At least if our SCD1 is in control, it will be. And judging on the China Health Study, this system works very nicely. Here's a fun fact. The stored body fat of Chinese rice eaters, primarily rice eaters or sweet potato eaters, is far more saturated than even an American on a carnivore diet. It's actually not even close. The fat of the Chinese starch eater is way more saturated than an American meat eater, because meat is mostly unsaturated fat. Animal fat is mostly unsaturated, right? That statement will probably blow most people's minds, but it's true. So if you
not poly, it's mono, right?
What's that?
It's not
poly. It's not poly. It's mono. It's monounsaturated. But monounsaturated is sufficient to cause fat storage, as we see in all the studies with SCD1. So, you know, SCD1 is the body's basic. It's the enzyme that it makes. When it wants to store fat, it makes more SCD1, and when it wants to burn fat, it reduces SCD1. So leptin does two main things. It increases fat oxidation rates, so you burn more fat in response to leptin, and leptin decreases SCD1. So leptin, by doing those two things, by sending more fat into the mitochondria and by having that fat be more saturated, you create more reactive oxygen species. That leads to the whole cycle of thermogenesis. The whole point of thermogenesis is to burn off extra calories. So if we go back to the Chinese person, it's harvest season, we're feasting for whatever reason, we pack on a few extra pounds during that season. well, now we're making more leptin because leptin is more or less proportional to the amount of fat that we have. So, okay, so now we're going to, over the next month, once the feasting season ends, we've got more leptin, we're burning more fat, we're doing more thermogenesis, our body temperature rises for a month, and we just burn off the extra calories. That's how it's supposed to work,
So is the American carnivore who's got more unsaturated fat in his body than the Chinese rice eater and sweet potato eater? Is that because they've had PUFAs before they switched to carnivore, or is it if they did carnivore from their birth on, it would still be that same dynamic?
Well, so we know that, right? I like to, on these kinds of questions, I always go back to the historical precedent, right? Like, we know that at some point they were probably eating primarily meat from birth on, and that's what their parents ate. And I think all the evidence that we have, I'm talking about looking at the archaeological record of humans from like 1 million years ago. But you could also look at bison hunters in the North American plains in the 1800s, living primarily on bison, right? And they seemed metabolically healthy. I don't think anyone would question that, right? So I think that works, right? I think that our body is designed to eat a largely meat and fat diet. I also think that it adapts quite well to a mostly starch diet.
How about meat and starch? Is that better? Is that the best of both worlds, or is that sloppy, lukewarm?
It's pretty tasty.
Yeah.
But I think that's exactly right. Is that then you see what emerges is this whole dairy culture, and that's what it is, right? Like European, and it's not just European, it's Asian, it's African. What you see around the world is, you see French eating buttered croissants. You see Tibetans eating noodles with yak butter tea, right, is the classic. You see Africans, the Maasai, living on, milk and blood and meat, right? And so, but when the Maasai are no longer warriors, they also include starch in their diets. And so all over the world, you see these cultures that combine mostly dairy fat with starch, and that always seems to work until the introduction of vegetable oils. That's when the whole thing seems to break down. And or sugar, sugar isn't great either. So I'll get back to your fructose question. One of the things that fructose does is it massively upregulates SCD1. So fructose unsaturates your fat. And that is, I think, why fructose causes fatty liver. Because when you eat a lot of fructose, your liver SCD1 specifically goes way up. And if you make a lot of SCD1 in your liver is going to get fat, because that's what happens.
Is that without the presence of heavy PUFA? That's what happens?
Yeah, no, that's entirely.
Is that a problem without heavy PUFA? I'm saying,
fructose?
Eating a lot of fructose on a regular basis.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a problem.
Really?
It's a problem because it makes your fat highly unsaturated via upregulation of SCD1. So I ended one of my posts about SCD1 with this another fun historical reference about the Native Americans is this one guy said, I've known Native Americans who only eat maple sugar. And he says, those are the only fat Native Americans I've seen. And so this was in the early 1700s. So Native Americans living a traditional lifestyle. I mean, they're literally in the forests cutting down trees to make the fires. They're dragging sap to the fires. I mean, this is a high, right? There's no higher exercise activity, if you've ever done it, especially if you don't own a chainsaw, than making maple syrup in the freezing cold New England winters, right? So these guys are up and down mountains carrying sap, which is heavy, carrying firewood, cutting wood with axes, I guess. Um, and if the ones of them who decided to live purely off the maple syrup, they could become obese.
Because it was fructose, a lot of fructose.
Because it's a lot of fructose, and I would argue that fructose.
It's not like honey where it's glucose and fructose balanced. Like
well, no, it is.
Okay.
It is, and you could probably, probably the same thing, or maybe the same thing would happen if you only ate honey, right? But nobody really only eats honey,
right?
Well, that I know of. But we have a historical account of people that do live entirely on maple sugar, and that they become obese. And it's clearly not because of lack of exercise. And so I think it's because, it's been shown very clearly that if you eat that much sugar, your SCD1 levels go up like tenfold.
And that's fructose.
Well,
does glucose do that? I've seen a high glucose honey that someone was.
Right. As far as I know, pure glucose doesn't upregulate SCD1, but I'm also not entirely sure. I think it's mostly due to the fructose content of the maple sugar, but that's a guess. I'm not sure.
Is there any other variables related that maybe could make SCD1 upregulated not a problem? Does that make sense? Is there another factor we could consider that would say, hey, you can dine on fruit all the time and you'll be fine. Just don't eat.
PUFAs I think that in most natural systems, I think this, like when you look at most natural diets, right? So people who, there are cultures, I think, that eat a lot of fruit, and there's this whole series of regulatory mechanisms that for the most part seem to keep SCD1 in check and kind of properly balanced. And there's systems that kick in when you go too far one way or the other that most of the time through most of human history seem to have worked. Not 100% of the time. I mean, there have always been fat French people, right? So I'm pointing to the French as an example where butter and flour mostly worked most of the time. It's not to say that historically there were zero French people. That's not true. But for most of them, it worked. And I think the same thing is probably true of fruit eating societies. These mechanisms, SCD1 is a very dynamic protein. Like its expression can go up tenfold in just a couple of hours. One thing, interestingly, that dramatically raises SCD1 is fasting. So it's your body's way of saying, like, wow, we haven't eaten in 2 days. Our energy supplies are really low. We've got to make more of this SCD1 so that the next time calories come in, we store it rather than burning it, right? Like that's what SCD1 is. It's a signal. I mean, all it does is unsaturate saturated fats, but the lack of saturation is a signal to store fat.
Interesting.
And so,
are you concerned with what fructose does to the liver? I've heard it compared to the way alcohol is processed by the liver, or do you not look at that aspect?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I myself as a wine drinker, as I pointed out, I think here already, and I talk about it on my blog, and I am concerned about that same thing. But I really like drinking wine. It works for me a lot of other ways. So, I keep doing it. And I'd like to talk about that in the future and the health effects of that, because that's interesting and different. And it's also a topic that most people have not.
Usually you hear is resveratrol, right? Is what everybody says about the health benefits of red wine. I'm assuming you have a different spin on that, right?
Yeah, I don't think, I don't know how.
So you think there's other health benefits to wine that's not been talked about as much, or is that what you're suggesting?
I mean, there probably are, but I just think that it's understudied. I think that it's understudied, and I think that what has been studied hasn't been that well publicized, right?
Okay.
I just
Yeah.
think I just think that ethanol needs a place at the table as another macronutrient, and we should be talking about the benefits and
Wow.
I do think
Really?
there are benefits to ethanol, but it's not going to be encapsulated in a single soundbite, right?
Right.
Like that's
Yeah. I'm
all.
just trying to set the table for a future discussion. That's interesting. So again, the common talking points of or was it resveratrol? What is it called? That's
Right,
not really the health
resveratrol.
benefit for wine. It's something else that we'll have
I
to save for
seriously
another
doubt it.
discussion.
I mean, there
Interesting.
might be good things about resveratrol. I'm not really
Yeah.
sure. I don't think that's the be all and end all
Interesting.
by any.
But perhaps
standard.
alcoholic beverages could have health benefits, is what you're suggesting, such that they should be considered a macronutrient, even, right? Wow.
Well, I mean, it is a
Ethanol.
macronutrient.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like an essential thing that people should integrate in their.
I don't know if I'd call it essential, but I think it works for some people.
Okay. For medicine or as preventative.
Well, it's a way of, it's interesting. Like, so for instance, I have an article on my blog that I call Wine Fasting, and this is a tool that I've used in my weight loss because as a regular wine drinker, I'm used to getting calories as ethanol, and for me, it blunts my appetite. Some people say that, oh, well, if I drink alcohol, then, I get this blood sugar crash later and I get the munchies. Well, for me, that doesn't happen because, my body's used to getting calories that way. And an interesting thing about ethanol is that it doesn't stimulate insulin production. And so, insulin is tied in with all of these things around saturated fats and polyunsaturated fats, largely there, and also leptin, right? It all ties in with insulin signaling. So to me, if I say like, well, I'm going to do this feast meal, I'm going to consume tons of stearic acid. The whole point of the feast meal is to get my metabolism up, to get my mitochondria to fuse together and to go into this fat burning mode. But then I want to go, the next day and just let it do its thing and let it burn up all this fat. Well, I can, have a bottle of red wine, and that gets me through the night, and I'm happy and I'm not hungry, and I wake up with energy. I feel good. That for me, that's a strategy that's worked. But interestingly, again, if you look at priests, like Catholic priests going back into the 1700s or 1600s, they have these days, what they call wine and oil fasting, which to me is very interesting because they're consuming, they're consuming olive oil and wine. That's all they can have on those days. And the olive oil is going to have all of the same benefits when I was talking about the OEA and the fact that it increases fat oxidation and it causes your liver to make more saturated fat, and it does all these things but pure fat like olive oil also doesn't stimulate insulin. And the other thing I should say about OEA from dietary monounsaturated fats, which have a very different biological role than monounsaturated fats that are created in your fat cells from SCD1. So this OEA, in the context of oil and wine fasting, is blunting your appetite. It's causing your body to burn more fat, and then they're also drinking wine, and neither of those things on their own increase insulin production. Mm-hmm. And so, to me, that's a very interesting system, and this has been happening for hundreds of years with Catholic priests, and I think it's pretty clever. Yeah. So I noticed that this was sort of working for me, this idea of like, well, I'm not really I ate a bunch of stearic acid this morning. I feel satisfied. At night, I'd have some wine. And there was a couple times, the genesis of the idea is I literally woke up a couple days and I was like, what did I have for dinner last night? And I was like, I don't even remember making dinner. And I was like, I forgot to make dinner, which to me was a revelation because that's never happened to me.
And that was it.
that was at the beginning of the croissant diet when I started really eating a ton of stearic acid, because I do find it very satiating.
And you still eat a lot of stearic acid?
I do. And so I
How
kind of,
much? Oh, every day.
that's a hard question, Joseph. Well, so right now I'm doing these, like I say, I'm doing these feasts to try to get my metabolism up. And so, so the meal I've been eating is like, it's the feast meal is like a pound of potatoes that I'm frying into French fries in beef suet. So that's about 35% stearic acid. And then I'm making a sauce with my my stearic acid enhanced butter oil that I sell at Fire in a Bottle. I'm making like I'm also doing these like chicken that I batter and fry. So that picks
What
up
flour? What flour do you use to batter? The masa?
No, I'm just using a mixture of white flour and cornstarch. But it's but so I found that pancakes are incredibly absorbent, and so if you want to palatably, the problem with highly saturated fats is they're waxy, right? They're not that palatable for a lot of people. So I found that by absorbing them into starches is the best way to actually consume them. And so I've been eating these, what I call pancake chicken, because it's kind of like chicken wrapped in pancakes, because you're basically dipping the chicken into pancake batter and then you fry it. And then I'm doing like hot wing sauce, which is made with the stearic acid enhanced butter oil. And so in this whole meal, I think I'm getting something like 50 to 60 grams of stearic acid. And that's a lot.
Now, does that cause gastrointestinal distress? A lot of people say when they eat a lot of saturated fat or like a high fat in general, they're going to have a lot of adjustments. Not
for
you?
me. And
Is
I
it because
think
you've
it's
been
just,
eating it so long, or?
I think that's exactly it. I think people complain about the same thing sometimes when they go to a keto or a carnivore diet and they're not used to eating that much saturated fat. And I think they say it's tied to the amount of lipase that you're making in your gut. It takes your gut a while to lipase is the thing that breaks down the fats so that you can import them. And I think it takes your digestive system a while to when you increase the amount of fat you're eating, to make more lipase so that you can digest it better. In my case, I think it doesn't bother me.
What about eating just raw, suet? Is that a good, just without cooking it? Is that good or not very effective for what you're trying to do?
I think that eating raw suet could be great for, the kind of strategy that I'm doing. I just don't particularly like raw suet. I'm a foodie, right? And I like cooking and I like making nice things. And so for me, the idea, I've eaten raw suet. It's okay. I don't get any enjoyment out of it though. And I like to enjoy my food and my meals. So to me, the raw suet leaves me sort of spiritually unhappy, even if it technically would fill me up and do the job.
Well, I've got a hard out here, but I've got so many questions that we're gonna have to leave it off on a cliffhanger here. But I'm just so just to clarify here, because I know we're just a little lightning time here, real quick. When you are eating the potatoes and everything, is that helping the weight loss? Or are you still trying to prove the point of I can enjoy these nice starches and still lose weight? If you took those out, would you, and just had stearic acid, would you, and whatever protein, would you be losing weight faster? What's the little 10-second conclusion there?
Yes, I think that you can. I think that probably if I left them out and was consuming the same amount of stearic acid, I might lose weight even faster. I tend to think, to me, there's something about the really highly saturated fat, the high stearic acid specifically with the starch, that leaves me feeling really satiated in a way that sometimes eating a steak doesn't. So I can eat a big steak and be hungry an hour or two later. But if I have the pancakes fried in stearic acid, I'm just I'm done for a while.
Is it really greasy, and does it make you feel greasy and nasty after you eat such a fatty?
No, it doesn't make me feel greasy and nasty. It just makes me feel really I just literal satiation. And that's not a feeling that I had much in my life until the last couple of years, truly I'll be eating and pick up my fork and say, you know what? Like, I can't take another bite. Like, I just can't. And I put it back down. I'm like, I'm done. I'm so done.
But if you don't have an
and
issue with with satiety, eating meat only, then don't need to add the potatoes necessarily, right? So to speak, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you can eat a steak and that
So the
satiates
starch
you
is just basically helping you with the satiety issue, so you don't, you know,
yeah. And
overeat.
most, I mean, look, mostly the starch is there as a vehicle for the stearic acid because I don't, like I say, I don't really like eating raw suet.
What about
Beef fat.
squash versus croissants for a
Sure.
delivery?
Yeah. I mean, I think squash would be fine. And I've also tried it with sweet potatoes, and that's great. I think anything. I don't really think it matters what the starch vehicle is per se. I just played around, and yeah, the things like pancakes are just incredibly absurd. Wheat flour. Say what you will about it. I know a lot of people have strong opinions about wheat flour, but it is very absorbent.
What about einkorn? Is einkorn healthier than these wheat flours in your perspective?
Probably. I mean, it probably is. There's probably a lot to that. The more ancient grains being, just better. I think a lot of people think that when, they hybridized wheat in the 40s through 60s with these dwarf Japanese varieties, and I think there's a lot of opinion that introducing those Japanese wheats, there was something about the Japanese strains of wheat, the miniature wheats, that made wheat more, immune reactive, give people a lot of the problems that we have associated with wheat consumption. I don't know if anyone's proven that, but that's certainly what a lot of people think.
So if you're eating, all right, we're almost out of time, but I got to land the plane. Then we're going to have you back on, and I'll set up the future. So
Sure,
I want everybody,
awesome.
first of all, I want everybody to go to Fire in a Bottle,
In a bottle, yes.
fireinaBottle.net, and check out the fantastic products they have. I'm trying his products out. I haven't tried them yet, but they're on their way, and so I'll let you know what I think.
Everybody check out Firebrand Meats. You can get pork that is very, very low in polyunsaturated fats.
Well, very good. And that's a big thing too. So folks who are doing carnivore, stay away from conventional PUFA fed chicken and pork. That's one conclusion we got to leave off with. Quick take: if you're eating a lot of carnivore heavy nutrition and you want to add a sidekick, do you go with fruits as a regular sidekick, or grains and potatoes and that kind of thing, based on the overall health of those?
You're asking?
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the classic meat and potatoes, or any other starch.
Not just for taste; it's based on what your understanding is with these different processes about obesity and.
Yes. If I was going to add one thing to a carnivore diet, it would be some type of starch. It doesn't even need to be that much, but I think a little bit helps get your blood sugar up after a meal, and I think somehow that affects satiation, although I don't know why yet. Right. That's just been my personal experience.
We're going to leave it here, but in the future, I want to ask you what physics might be able to bring to the table to understand some of these more minutiae, complex processes in the body. So I'm going to see if I can get my physicist friend, Dr. Wei-Ping Yu, to come on and talk a little bit about that, just to see,
nice.
Thinking out loud. I want to get into senescent cells and how this relates to senescent cells, dysfunctional aging cells in the body, how saturated fat versus PUFAs overconsumption might have some connection there.
Nice.
And I want to get into Dr. Thomas Seyfried's theory. Are you familiar with him, Dr. Thomas Seyfried from Boston College?
Yes.
Metabolic theory of cancer, mitochondrial dysfunction, and
that's a very interesting topic that I'd like to research more, and it plays a lot into the kinds of things I'm talking about. But for next time, sure.
Yeah. So those are some little cliffhangers for folks. And Brad Marshall, has been great having you on, and I look forward to trying your products, and I want others to check them out too. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Very good. All right, that's it. We'll talk soon.
All right, talk soon.